Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, party leaders seek to amend China's constitution with a review of the draft amendments. What do proposed changes do to the nation's charter mean for its future? And what a year for U.S. President Donald Trump. We'll talk about the triumphs and tribulations of America's commander-in-chief since he took office a year ago. You are watching World Insight. We start with the proposed amendments to China's constitution. The Communist Party of China has convened a key plenum in Beijing to review proposed changes to parts of the nation's charter. A communique issued after the meeting recognized the inclusion of major guidelines and theories settled after 19th CPC National Congress to the constitution, especially the Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. The document has also stressed that the reform in China's national supervision body is a significant move in strengthening the party and the country's self-discipline. The proposal will be explained later in March at the annual session of China's top legislature, the National People's Congress, and a vote on the amendments will take place then. The proposal on the revision of the Constitution was adopted at the meeting. So what do we know so far about the proposed amendment and what's the changes? Take a look at this.
Amendments to the Constitution are to be proposed by the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, or by more than 1/5 of the deputies to the National People's Congress, and adopted by the vote of more than 2/3 of the deputies to the Congress. The NPC exercises its powers to amend and supervise the enforcement of the Constitution. The Constitution amending process must follow such principles as upholding the CPC's leadership, sticking to the path of justice of socialism with Chinese characteristics, and adhering to correct political direction. The statement also says the amendment must focus on some parts rather than an overhaul of the Constitution, to make sure that it could not only meet the demands of the party and people, but also follow the rules of the Constitution and Law Department, so as to keep the Constitution's continuity, stability, and authority. The Constitution's last amendment was made in 2004 to include guarantees regarding private property and human rights. In 1999, the amendment was made to include a new paragraph, reading, "The People's Republic of China governs the country according to law, and makes it a socialist country under rule of law." The 1993 amendment included adding a new sentence to the preamble, that the system of the multi-party cooperation and political consultation led by the Communist Party of China will exist and develop for a long time to come. While in 1988, the Constitution was revised to permit the private sector of the economy to exist and develop within the limits prescribed by law.
For more on the second plenary session of the 19th CPC Central Committee and the constitutional amendments in the pipeline, we are joined by two guests. In Beijing, Fu Jun, Professor of Political Economy with the National School of Development at Peking University. Welcome, Professor. Also joining us in Chicago, we have Professor Dali Yang, who is a William C. Rivas Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Welcome as well, Professor Yang. I want to start with you, Professor Fu. Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics in the new era. Of course, that's a phrase that came up during the 19th Party Congress, concluded just a few months ago. But how much should we look at it with the perspective that China is upgrading its governance and the Chinese Communist Party is doing the same?
Well, if you sort of see the dimensions of his thought, here are principal dimensions. One is we need to be engaged in political construction, engaged in economic construction, social construction, cultural construction, the construction of ecology. At the same time, he said four goals. One is to comprehensively build a moderately prosperous society by 2020. Then that goes up. The other is to make sure we have a very strict discipline for the party, and also deepening the reform in a comprehensive way.
Right. There are a lot of terminologies. Actually, they're very Chinese in a way when it comes to translation of English. But what exactly does it mean? Obviously, it seems that the goal is different from, let's just say, previous generations of leadership when they were facing a very different China. Professor.
Well, early on, there is a big debate whether you take private property very seriously. Now, it seems we have settled that debate, so that part is written into the Constitution. Now, this time, rule of law. Previously, we have been debating about rule by law or rule of law. And in previous documents, two concepts, rule by law and rule by law, rule of law, come up simultaneously. But in this document, it's rule of law that comes up uniformly.
All right, let's go to Professor Yang. Of course, you're based in Chicago and probably have a different perspective as to how this would mean about the upgraded way of governing China, of looking at China, particularly for the next years to come. Professor Yang.
Well, I think certainly we are all very curious and very interested in the upcoming revision of the Constitution. As your reporter has noted, in fact, it's been the current Constitution of 1982 had been revised 4 times, and the last revision was in 2004. The last 4 revisions, each of them actually was significant in terms of emphasizing new elements that China already actually had began to show up in society, in the economy, including private property and the rule of law in those respects. So I think actually people are very interested in looking at this new package and to see how it's going to be adopted. Most importantly, however, the communique from the Central Committee emphasized that it's not a major overhaul. Is going to introduce element and emphasize continuity. And I think actually that's very interesting because it shows the different interests in how they are discussing this particular issue. And in particular, how to incorporate a major new state institution into the Constitution without actually upsetting elements that have already been adopted previously.
This is quite a balance to be taken, of course, Professor Yang. So having said that, though, let's talk about what China is facing and therefore whether these amendments to the Constitution are really likely to address those challenges and address them in the right way. Professor Yang, as you may know very well, China now is different. I mean, compared to 2004, the last time the Constitution was amended. China now becomes the 2nd largest economy in the world, even though it is still a big way behind the United States, but it's already become quite a power. Meanwhile, internationally, the way China expresses itself, the China sees the world, also matters a lot to the rest of the world. Meanwhile, China has already proposed several kinds of policies and schemes in which the world could work together, Belt and Road just for example. So Mr. Yang, at this point, when you see new amendment elements to the Constitution, how they are likely to work with the current status of China in the world? I think that is the most interesting question, particularly to our international viewers. Professor Yang.
Yeah, I think the most interesting aspect is currently the Communist Party, Communist Party already actually has the Central Discipline Inspection Commission for party discipline and also for anti-corruption. But as many people know, as the Communist Party leadership emphasizes, this institution sometimes is actually operates in a way that's legally a little bit in the gray area. And I think one of the major developments, therefore, by introducing the State Supervision Commission is to actually incorporate what the party already does and make it part of a state institution as actually enshrined in the Constitution. But of course, constitutional scholars and so on immediately raise the issue that this is almost like a new branch of the state. As a result, actually, it requires more constitutional justification than simply saying that, oh, we need a new institution and therefore let's get it started. Already experiments are happening at the local level in several provinces and cities. So I think actually it's a good sign that the party is taking those objections seriously and saying that, oh, we actually do need to amend the Constitution by actually incorporating the State Supervision Commission into the constitutional framework. But of course, I think actually the communique does emphasize that they want to see consensus and debate and democratic deliberation. And I think people would be watching very closely to see what are the specific details, what are the different interests that needs to be addressed. Because the new commission, how would it work and how does it actually sort of mesh in with the existing legal framework would be extremely interesting. And as you emphasized, China already is such a prominent player globally, and therefore the rest of the world will be extremely interested.
Exactly. Professor Fu, of course, from now until the so-called 2 sessions, when the time the National Congress is being held, that is also the time when the delegates are going to vote on the amendments of the Constitution. There's still a few months to go, but you can expect some debates in different areas relating to the topics Professor Yang just mentioned. Having said that, though, there's another issue. The reason why there's a discussion about amendments to the Constitution is China wants its system to work efficiently. There are several words that they're trying to describe this, centralized, unified, authoritative, and also highly effective. Professor Fu, of course, when it comes to governance styles internationally, there are different styles, different ways, different mechanisms. So when China emphasizes these words, what do you think China is having in mind right now? What kind of message does it send to the rest of the world, Professor Fu?
Well, China has been saying that Constitution is the most fundamental building blocks of a power structure. And to create a new part of the power structure, a appropriate way to go with that so that you have legal authorities that you need to amend the Constitution. As Professor Yang said previously, the party has been going very strong in terms of anti-corruption, but they have been operating in somewhat gray areas. Now, with the new power part of the structure, it is appropriate to be incorporated into the Constitution. So that is all part of the parcel of taking the Constitution very serious. After all, you are creating a very powerful power structure there. And for the market to operate smoothly, theoretically, market cannot work in the absence of rule of law. And this is true not only here in China, but also globally. And I guess another piece of adding to the Constitution is to build a community of shared future for mankind. So to take the legal framework very seriously is an indication that China and also the party is moving in that direction.
Of course, the Constitution is for the country itself. But Professor Yang, here's the thing. There is debate about governance styles worldwide these days, particularly about the efficiency and the procedures to get efficiency vis-a-vis so-called consensus building, which may take quite some time. So how do you see China's own experiments about looking for its own governance style and governance efficiency? How is it likely to contribute to that discussion worldwide, Professor? Yeah.
Well, I think number one, actually whatever happens in China already has a consequence globally. In fact, in foreign aid, in many areas of cooperation with other countries, for example, Chinese companies and institutions, very often when they go abroad, they bring their own practices because that's usually what people know. Executives, consultants, professors, they actually base many of their ideas on the experience that they have. So therefore, whatever happens does matter. Although sometimes, of course, there is a give and take. For example, what happened in some parts of Africa, some of the corporate practices were criticized a few years ago. And that got a lot of attention from Chinese executives and also government officials. And there were changes as well. And I think at the same time, there's a lot of effort also currently by the leadership to say where we can go further than what we already have done. And China has certainly taken a leadership role on the issue of climate change policies. Right. And of course, in this particular context, China really led the world in terms of pushing forward the frontier of global governance.
Having said that, though, Professor Yang, we all know very clearly this year marks the 40th anniversary of the start of China's reform and opening up. So here is the question. Many from the rest of the world wonder, is this going to be continuity in China's determination and commitment to reform and opening up, to be able to challenge itself? Eventually, it would progress. Professor Yang, what's your feeling, given the recent debate on the Constitution amendments, given the recent decision in the proposal, and what about the atmosphere here in China? What does it say to you?
Well, the most striking thing, I've spent many years looking at the issue of reform and the politics of reform. Immediately in the 1970s, at the end of the 1970s, China has gone through a tremendous era of political turmoil and some issues of significant issues of poverty and so on. So the entire country actually was eager for change. So in that sense, actually, economists and political science emphasize it was a moment of reform that was almost what we call Pareto optimal. Everyone benefited by actually engaging in reforms, in opening up. But of course, as China has developed, there are always vested interests that develop. People who actually have gained tremendously in the past now wants to maintain those gains and sometimes want to keep the gains to themselves. And this happens in every society in many ways. So further reform, therefore, actually requires reconfiguring the current setup of interest, of institutions, and actually also try to actually really take care of those people who are left behind. So in that sense, actually, how to make the development more inclusive domestically is extremely important, and the Communist Party leadership has emphasized that. President Xi in particular has been very adamant about the importance of fighting against poverty. And so globally, I think actually it's also very interesting because there are some concerns that in certain areas China has actually not done as much in terms of opening up. And I think actually a lot of the conversations today are trying to push the equation, push the frontier forward in corporate governance, in terms of the relations between the government and also the corporate sector, and also how do you deal with foreign investment. And of course, President Xi and Premier Li have been emphasizing, for example, administrative rationalization continuously to reduce burdens on businesses and so on.
People say, Professor Fu, there is a will, there is a way. We all know what China's challenges are, and the many challenges China could face if it continues with its current steps of reform and opening up. But I guess, Professor Fu, it has to be done. So how should we see that eternal issue with the lens of looking at today's issue of amendments to the Constitution, Professor Fu?
Well, the amendments at least give us the indication that China is looking at what is supposed to be done in the long term, not short term, not just looking at 5 years. Very importantly, a critical difference this time is the Constitution will enshrine Xi's thought on socialism with the Chinese characteristics for a new era. That means this is a long time horizon. And behind that, if you read the documents this time and the previous documents, there are two daunting tasks that China continue to face. If China continue to move forward, both economic and political. One is we have to deepen market-oriented reforms. In the Chinese terminology, is we must let the market play a decisive role, even though in practice there will be zigzags. But the document says said that very clearly. The other is we must set up a system of rule of law, not rule by law. Of course, you cannot wish those things will up and running overnight. It will take long-term efforts because institutions, after all, are historically and socially embedded. It takes a long time to sort of to build those systems so that China, as well as the world, will have a better chance for peace and prosperity.
As being recognized by many Chinese, and certainly the Chinese government as well as the Chinese Communist Party. The ultimate conflict in this country is the demand for a better life by the public and the insufficient and not yet satisfying development of this economy and this society. We'll see, we hope, with all their actions, that conflict will be addressed. For now, I want to thank both of you professors for being with us. Don Li Yang from Chicago joining us, and Fu Jun here in Beijing. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. Have a great weekend. Thank you. And stay with us here on World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program, we will talk about the promises that the U.S. President Donald Trump made and delivered, the successes and challenges on the eve of Mr. Trump's first anniversary in the White House, right after this break. Yes, and you are watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. It has been a year since Donald Trump raised his right hand in an oath to become the 45th President of the United States. Over the year, there have been huge changes, to say the least, in American diplomatic and domestic policies. What has been the impact of the Trump administration on Washington politics, the U.S. economy, trade and diplomacy with the rest of the world? Before the discussion with our panelists, let's take a look at this.
It's been nearly a year since Donald Trump entered the White House.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
From this day forward, a new vision will govern our land. From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
America First began with the withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Deal, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the UNESCO. He tried to push for his controversial immigration ban on Muslim-majority countries, but he's still nowhere near building a wall along the U.S. southern border with Mexico. He did deliver on another campaign promise.
Therefore, I have determined that it is time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
America First, the battle cry of the tweeter-in-chief with probably the least political experience. Mr. Trump was quick to trumpet the impact of his policy on the U.S. economy.
The number of Americans applying for unemployment benefits just hit a 45-year low.
But some economists are cautious with 2017's economic growth, as it may damage both the Chinese and American economies in the long run. Chinese President Xi Jinping met with Mr. Trump for the first time in April last year, a good sign, but the ups also came with some downs, like the threat of a trade war. U.S. economic ties with China were also tested when Mr. Trump, on numerous occasions, turned political cooperation over the DPRK, a bargaining chip for trade deals.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
Mr. Trump's tweets often determine U.S. foreign policy, such as his war of words with DPRK leader Kim Jong-un. But the most contentious relations are with Russia, the one constant that hounded the Trump administration with an investigation into possible Russian meddling in the 2016 election. Overall, Mr. Trump has his work cut out for him nearly a year into his administration.
What a year for President Donald Trump, and certainly for the rest of the world. For more on Trump's first anniversary in the office, we are joined in our Beijing studio, Rong Ying, who is Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir. Also joining us in Washington, D.C., Douglas Paul, Vice President of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Welcome, sir. And in Iowa, U.S. as well, Timothy Hagel, a professor of political science at the University of Iowa. We are having a very strong panel today. I want to start with you, Professor Hagel, since you are talking about domestic politics. Let's start with you. Oh, a lot of roller coasting. I probably feel that, and the rest of the world as well. But the question is, what word would you use to describe it? What word would you use to describe him? Professor Hagel.
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Professor Hagel. The question
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
After 1 year, what adjective would you use to describe this presidency? What adjective would you use to describe this presidency?
Well, President Trump's presidency in the first year has had sort of a mixed review, as was indicated in the report that you ran earlier. He has some successes, obviously the Tax Reform Act. He's done some things that have kept the economy going, have given people hope that the economy is going to get better for a lot of people, not just the people at the top. But as also indicated, there have been some bumps along the road, both in terms of international sorts of situations. His view of how he conducts diplomacy is quite different from previous presidents, and we still have conflicts going on with other nations, and particularly the DPRK.
All right, Trump wraps up a year in the office. Let's see how he's doing. The lowest average approval rating, according to the latest report. That is according to the polling by Gallup, which shows that he has averaged just a 39% approval rating since his inauguration. The previous low was held by Bill Clinton, whose first-year average stood 10 points higher than Trump's at 49%. Of course, you got the other numbers coming from other presidents. Those presidents could do better, sometimes worse, in the other years of their presidency. Having said that, though, let me go to you, Mr. Rong, here in Beijing. How do you, from outside, see that president?
I would just say it's quite difficult to give a grade to Trump presidency, because it all depends on what kind of a metric you are taking. If you're
very diplomatic, right?
Yeah, if a traditional metric, like the opinion poll we're talking about, I think is the lowest. I got a different, even lower sort of approval rate. I heard it's 35% approval and 56 disapproval. He's the lowest in the post-World War. But if you look at his track record, if you look at the expectations and look at how much or changes or the shift that has been taken, brought to the White House, I think he's doing relatively...
You have to elaborate on that, because I'm sure a lot of viewers internationally and also in the United States do not necessarily agree with you that Trump has achieved a lot. Probably you have to explain what exactly you meant.
No, I'm not saying he has achieved a lot. I'm saying that he could have done much worse. That's the point I would like to make. But to be fair, I think it's quite mixed, and it will still take some time to look at. Some, if you even look at the domestically, some of the agendas he achieved, and which I think the previous Republican administration has not been able to do that. For example, the so-called Obamacare, the tax cut issues, and so on and so forth, and the deregulation issues and others. Diplomatically, I think, of course, he's done a lot of damage. I mean, by withdrawing the TPPs. I mean, the 3 days after this, coming into the office, and he also made a lot of twists. I mean, very. Some of them are very worrying or cause a lot of, apprehensions. But in the end, I think, as far as I can see, he's quite, in a way that is not as being unpredictable or it could have, as I said, it could have done worse.
It really depends on what kind of metrics you're using, as you said, sir, earlier. But Professor Hagel, here's the thing. When we talk about President Trump, people, shrug it off, saying, this is a guy that makes politics with entertainment. But on the other hand, if you look at the way that he's communicating with his constituencies, it has been quite effective. So does he provide you with any food for thought as to what kinds of political leadership these days people are looking for, and the qualities, the shifts of qualities of political leadership that people are looking for? Professor Hagel.
I think that's probably true, and what we apparently found in the United States was that the people generally were very unhappy with their political leaders, that for whatever reason things weren't getting done in Congress. The president seemed to be stymied. President Obama came in, made all kinds of promises, but found that he wasn't able to work with Congress even when he had a majority, although he did get his signature issue through the Affordable Care Act. But in terms of many other things, he had great problems, and even more so after Republicans took control of Congress. And people were just getting tired of it, that they thought that they were being lied to and so forth, and so as a result, they looked for something different. Now, of course, the 2016 election was basically a one-off in the sense that because of the nature of the two candidates, that's what allowed Trump to win. That if perhaps Democrats had nominated somebody other than Hillary Clinton, that maybe Trump wouldn't have won, so they would have gone, they being the voters, would have gone for somebody more traditional. But as it is, this is what we've got right now. Now, will we stay with that in the future? My guess is probably not. That we'll go back eventually, if not in 2020 and 2024, to somebody more traditional. But at least for right now, this is what we have, and this is what we need to deal with.
Well, people wonder whether it's a hiccup in the history of U.S. presidency, or actually it is the direction that the U.S. policy is likely to do, and also how U.S. is seeing itself. And here comes to the ultimate question, isn't it, Mr. Rong? That is, how the U.S. is looking at itself. What role it would play internationally. Particularly for the Chinese, I guess it's very relevant, this question. What is your reading of that through Trump presidency, at least first year?
I think the U.S. in general, as far as I can see, is that they all feel that there's something, must be something wrong. And they are looking for, as I think the previous speakers talking, they are looking for something different, or looking for an option that would help U.S. to address both domestic issues and more also as importantly, I think, internationally.
Right.
I think Trump provides an option that he feels would help U.S. to address issues. So at in his inaugural address, he announced that America, America First approach, a vision, and he feels that U.S. deserves, and that would help U.S. to address these issues. But in the end, it seems that in practice, it caused a lot of problems, uncertainties. Not only, I think, the elites, the establishment, in U.S., but more importantly, its allies. And of course, the world at large. So I would say that possibly it's a kind of experience, it's a kind of attempt by,
But you know, how would you know? Because the U.S. economy is getting better. You know, when you look at the numbers, jobs are being provided as well. So the way that the U.S. is looking at itself, America First, maybe it's not favored by the rest of the world. But it might be, as many Americans see, to the American national interest. If that would be the case, and given what politics is today, how could you expect that to change, even for the next president who is different from Donald Trump? But maybe that will still be the theme of politics for the future. Mr. Rong.
Oh yeah, that's certainly it's a big question, I think,
That's right.
facing a Trump presidency or President Trump, if you want to, run for the elections in 2020. And by that time, hopefully, the economy of U.S. is doing as well as today, which is a big question mark. And then even if it is doing as well, then how much President Trump can claim the credit for that, because there are
He's already doing that. He's already doing that. You know better than I do, Professor Hagel, about that. But having said that, though, for international relations is a different story compared to, let's just see, the rosy economic growth picture. So what the U.S. is going to do, particularly now when you have a very weak State Department, when you still have many of the vacancies of the diplomatic positions not necessarily being filled, obviously you have a bigger voice coming from the White House, and also a bigger voice coming from the President himself when it comes to directions of U.S. foreign policy. Professor Hagel, what is your judgment of this direction? What would that mean?
Well, to a certain extent, the direction is a bit of a holdover from the Obama administration. You mentioned the fact that there are a lot of vacancies, and that means that it doesn't mean that things aren't getting done. What it means is that career State Department officials are handling those duties, and they would tend to perhaps continue the Obama administration's policies. That doesn't necessarily, isn't necessarily consistent with the Trump administration's desires, and that causes a bit of a conflict, and sometimes there's mixed messages coming between the President and the State Department and so forth, and so that has to be worked out. But hopefully those vacancies will be filled, and the Trump administration, after initially focusing more perhaps on domestic policy, can, in the remaining years of its first administration, and we'll see if Trump gets reelected, of course, but at least in the remaining 3 years, see if it can then perhaps focus a bit more on the international side of things.
I see. We also have Mr. Paul with us on the phone. We were struggling with him on the video, but okay, we haven't got it done yet. Let's come back to you, Mr. Rong, about further on the diplomatic side. You see issues relating to diplomacy, several areas. One is hotspot issues, DPRK, for example. That's one of them, and the Middle East as well. And you see also longer-term issues about how one country positions itself internationally, how it's contributing or withdrawing from international governance. You also see its important bilateral relations, such as right now, China and the United States. One could argue it's one of the most important bilateral relations in the world. So how, on those very different levels, do you see President Trump, his presidency, so far, and its impact?
On the bilateral relation between China and the U.S., I would say, to be fair, they are being, even though it started, with quite a rocky one, but so far I see that the presidency is dealing with the relationship pretty well. And over the past 1 year, certainly if you look at the two presidents, President Xi and President Trump, we had more than 2 meetings actually. And the Mar-a-Lago meetings was very successful, but of course the visit to Beijing, China, President Trump would call it the so-called state visit plus, was, I think, helpful in a sense to stabilize the relationship. And overall, I think the relationship remains on steady and sort of footing, while with the full framework, full dialogue, mechanism that serves as a pillar. And I think that but of course there are other issues that that may disturb the relationship.
We'll have you, Mr. Rong, to come back and discuss about that, because Mr. Paul now could join us as a very well-known scholar from the United States about U.S.-China relations. Mr. Paul, my question same to you as to Mr. Rong. That is, different layers, bilateral relations, hotspot issues, and how the U.S. is dealing with the greater regional issues such as the Middle East and the Asia Pacific. How do you see this presidency's impact and his way of doing things? Mr. Paul. Do we have a problem? Do we have a problem? Mr. Paul, can you hear me? We still have a problem over there. Well, we hope more can be done technically in order to get across to him. But I want to continue about that, Mr. Hagel, here in the United States, in Iowa. Tell me about how the international relations, the presidency's policies, and the image it projects as a result would influence his domestic agenda. Help us know more about that, Professor Hagel.
Well, in terms of the relationship between the domestic and the international, the domestic, of course, side of things is important, particularly for voters, especially the economy, sorts of things that are going on. And as we come into get close to the 2018 midterm elections, that will be particularly the case. But those issues are also related to the international side of things, particularly with the economic concerns. One of the things that Trump talked about a lot had to do with bringing jobs back, bringing their money back to the United States, and we've seen some companies begin to do that. And to that extent, then it will affect trade relations with various companies along those lines. And as much as maybe initially that might hurt some relations in terms of the economics and trade and so forth, hopefully in the long run it provides a more stable and more enduring kind of relationship with a lot of countries. And of course Trump is looking to deal more bilaterally with nations, and so that may help his hand, strengthen his hand in making those agreements.
It's already 1 year. We already gone through that. Let's see what's going to happen to the rest of the few years of his presidency. Promise or not? It's unknown. But for now, I want to thank actually the three of you. Douglas Paul, who has been earlier connected to us, and Timothy Hagel and Ron Ying. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me for this discussion. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. And have a great weekend, everyone.